Welcome back. This talk is a continuation of the talk on the basic concepts of five-element acupuncture theory and philosophy. And I just want to emphasize that these talks are quite short because in a normal teaching situation, there's a lot of interaction and questions that brings up people's misconceptions or confusions. So it's worth going back and watching these short films so you can come up with your own questions which you can then send to us or join us in the class to discuss further. It is important that you learn this in a linear fashion. Each talk does stand alone. However, it is much more helpful to you and for your understanding if you do follow the order that we're giving you and build on each talk. So I'm going to very quickly review what we did last time, just so we can join the different pieces together, because this is like an incredibly huge puzzle that we're going to look at individually, and by the end of it, you'll have every single piece, and hopefully every single piece in place, or we'll help you get there with that. So today's talk is about the law of the five elements. And law is an interesting word. We tend to think of it as kind of punitive in some ways. Laws to tell us what to do, laws to govern us. But that is what a law is about. A law is there for a reason. It's to maintain the order. And obviously in our culture, laws change because we have different ideas come in, we have different governments come in, and human behavior changes, and our kind of moral compass can also change. However, natural laws do not change. And this is absolutely fundamental to this system of medicine. It's the part of this medicine that makes it foolproof. The natural laws do not change until further notice. For example, the seasons have a natural order. That is part of natural law. They do not change order on an annual basis. So we're going to talk about the first of the natural laws, which is the law of the five elements. And let's just briefly talk about how we got here. So going back to the last talk on the emergence of the five elements, we started with the Tao, which cannot be spoken of, is nothing. And then we came in with the water, which came in at 1. We then came in with the fire, which came in at 2. We then had the wood that came in at 3, and the metal at 4, and the earth sat in the center at 5. So this is the early infrastructure of the universe as we know it, and how we break it down to understand the different parts so we can look at the whole. So let's now look at laws. So natural laws. The reason we're calling these natural laws is because what we've learned from this first talk on the emergence is that it emerged naturally. The relationships emerged from one to the other. So from the water came the fire, and the dynamic of the fire and water came the wood. So what we're seeing is that this is something that evolved naturally and became fixed in its pattern. The emergence of form in life in 5 is the outcome of that movement. And as I say, until further notice, that has not changed. So everything that we know in the outside world, everything we know within ourselves, is governed by this natural movement that emerged from nothing to something. And that's why this system of medicine is so powerful, because every single thing we do is rooted in reality, in truth. There is no kind of question, there is no investigation, there is no scientific research. We are working with the facts of life. And that's now what we're going to start to break down and look at. So the first of the laws that we're going to learn is the law of the five elements. So we've already talked about the five elements, and let's look at them in more detail now. So the five elements, we talk about them as individual components of a whole, in a sense. In the Chinese tradition, it's also known as the five phases. So they're not actually seen then as something solid, but as movements, or the 5 seasons. But for our purposes, because we do need to break it down to understand each given part, we need to understand each element intimately. We need to really understand that these are like little kaleidoscope places that we can look into and find a whole other world. So let's start with the first element. Now, when I say first, there's no such thing as first really, because it's a cycle we're now looking at, but we're going to start down here with the water element. So the water element is what we know of water, the oceans, the rivers, the water we drink. It's this mysterious material fluid that can change from ice to steam. It can flow, it can get stuck. It's kind of magical in some ways. In a lot of ways, we take it for granted. But this is the base element here. This is, from our understanding from before, is the number one, the beginning of everything. So here we have the water. And then here we have the wood. The wood, of course, is what we associate with wood outside. The trees, the grass, everything that grows, everything that you're particularly aware of in the springtime. So this is more tangible than the water in some ways. It's something that emerges, and it is something that rises up and then can also be broken down, which we'll come to. Then we move up to the fire element. So the water to the wood to the fire. The fire is, of course, associated with the sunshine, the sun, the fire up in the heavens, the fire that we work with on earth, how we warm things, how our body is warmed. We also know from our original story that here we have the opposite of the water, and that the fire came from the water, so it lifted above. And here we have that story of the 1, the 2, and the 3. So there's that nice relationship of mummy, daddy, and the baby. So here we have the first 3 elements emerging. So our next element is the earth element. If you remember, the earth essentially begins at the center and fills the spaces, but in the cycle of creation, which is what we're talking about here, the earth is positioned over here, which I'll explain in a moment. So there's the earth element, and then back down to the bottom, we have the metal element. Now, apologies for my circles if they're not perfect. This is why I have a chart, which we'll use later. But you get the idea that here we have the 5 elements. And then we're saying there is a law about the 5 elements. So it's not good enough that they're just these individual elements just out there doing their thing. There is a natural law that is essential to our understanding of how these elements work together. So the law of the 5 elements describes the natural order of life. So we can see that this is the order. This order does not change. We're not going to suddenly flip wood over here and metal up here. So the law states these are the 5 elements as they manifest in life, as they manifest within us. If we think about the seasons, which is probably the best way to understand the elements, because it's a movement of life, we have the winter down here. We associate winter with it being colder, wetter, more rain. This is where the reserves of water build up. The associated season here is the spring. So the wood is when the wood emerges from within the ground, fed by the water. And up here we have the summer, which is the fire. So it's when there is more heat, more light, longer days. The earth relates to late summer. Now this is an interesting one because the Chinese recognized late summer as its own season, albeit short. It recognized the importance of what late summer does, which is it brings in the harvest or the abundance, the fruits and so on. So this is an extra season compared to our Western idea where we just have the 4 seasons. And then the metal relates to the autumn. So the law of the 5 elements is broken down into 2 different sections. And the first section we're going to talk about is the Sheng Cycle. So Sheng is the Chinese word for creative, generative. It's a life-sustaining, life-giving cycle. And this is a natural cycle. It is a law that cannot be broken. It is a movement that only goes in one direction. And what the Sheng Cycle is that the water gives rise to the wood, upwards. The wood gives rise to the fire. The fire gives rise to the earth, and the earth gives rise to the metal, and the metal gives rise to the water. So we see now this movement. We see how these are connected to each other. I'm obviously drawing them as individual cycles, but really we're talking about phases. Just like the season, the winter blends into the spring and the spring blends to the summer, down to late summer, down to autumn. So we see this merging, this natural organic pattern. But each season is unique, each element is unique. So the Sheng cycle, being the word creative cycle, tells us that there is a power of creation that happens within this cycle. And what it teaches us is that the water creates the wood. The wood creates the fire. The fire creates the earth, and the earth creates the metal, and the metal creates the water. So having gone from these elements emerging spontaneously, one from the other, to create the 5, we now see how this now transforms into, just like a wheel, turning, moving, rolling forward. Just as we understand time rolling over and life moving in its own natural pattern. We are born, we grow up, we get older, and we die. And the same with the seasons and everything in it. So this is explaining, first of all, why, and then how. And we're seeing how it works. So, for example, how does the water create the wood? Well, wood cannot emerge without the water. If you have a seed and you don't water it, there is no wood. So we know that the water is the source or the creator of the wood. That also tells us that the winter creates the spring. The kind of spring we have is dependent on the kind of winter we had. So we're now seeing this relationship here. The water creates the wood. Therefore, the wood creates the fire. It does that by burning. The fire needs fuel. It can only sustain itself by having the source of energy which comes from the wood. And we know that. We make a fire in the woods, we put the wood on the fire, it burns, we put petrol in our cars, it powers the engine. So here we see this natural relationship. The fire is totally dependent on the wood is totally dependent on the water. The fire creates the earth. And this is an interesting one for me. I never quite really understood that until I went to Hawaii, and I went on one of these helicopter trips, and we flew down over a volcano. And watching this fire shooting out of the ocean, and immediately as it hits the water, turning into earth, realizing that all of the earth that we stand on erupted from deep within the oceans and then solidified to create form. So this is how we know that the fire creates the earth. The earth creates the metal. So the earth the pressure of gravity, the earth being pressed down and giving form, creates the minerals, the precious stones, the metals deep within the ground. And then finally, the metal creates the water. This is a difficult one often for people to understand. We need to go back and understand the nature of water first of all. Water, you can't really hold onto it. It's very difficult. Even if you hold it in your hands, it will go through your fingers. And if it gets too warm, it will evaporate. So it's this kind of mystical substance. Therefore, for it to be able to collect, to give rise to the wood, we have to have a container. And it's the metal deep within the ground that produces the solid container underneath so that the water can collect and give rise to the wood. So we can see that these relationships, these creative relationships, the way that life is sustained outside of us and inside of us, because this is the same mechanism that happens inside of us, they are all completely interdependent. So if any one of these go wrong, it can produce problems. They are one family that create each other. And that's what we call the Sheng Cycle. This is a law of the 5 elements. This is the only way it goes. It cannot go backwards, and it is a moving cycle, and it is clockwise. The sun rises and the sun sets. So that's our first cycle. It's a very simple cycle. It's something that we are on some level aware of all the time. It governs everything, every organ in our body, every thought we have, and everything we perceive in nature and the people around us. This law is in everything we experience in life. So a deep, profound understanding of this in yourself and other people will change the way you perceive life. And it gives you an understanding that is not calculation, it's reality. So the next cycle we have, which is also part of the law of the 5 elements, is what's called the co-cycle. And sometimes you'll see it written as the cycle. These are different translations. And the word co or que simply means control. So here we have this wheel turning nicely. And then what nature does is it brings in a level of control to manage, to give strength, to ensure that this profound experience of life emerging and evolving is held properly in place, just like a wheel. So the co-cycle operates in a very different way. Let's start back down here in the water. So the co-cycle, nature tells us that water controls the fire. If you have a fire and you want to put it out, you throw water on it. If you want to stop sweating so much, drink more water. We know that it's a natural relationship, that the water, when it's balanced, will make sure the fire doesn't get out of control. So if there's a forest fire, that will be stopped by a river. So nature has this mechanism, it has this relationship between these 2 elements that ensures that the fire is kept in control by the water. The fire controls the metal. So metal is hard, can become brittle, unusable. And so nature gives us this relationship where the warmth of the sun, the power of fire, the power of burning can smelt the metal, can keep the metal the right temperature, keep it so it's malleable, so when it's deep within the ground, it provides the right infrastructure for the water. So we start to see how important these 3 are together. The water ensuring the fire doesn't burn out of control, so that the fire can control the metal, and of course the metal creates the water. So you start to see lots of different relationships emerging. The metal controls the wood. The metal cuts the wood. So in nature, if the wood's getting out of control, so if you go out into your garden and the ivy has gone completely crazy, you go with your secateurs and you cut. You limit the growth of the wood so it doesn't take over. You chop the wood so you can put it on the fire. So we see there's a natural relationship here that the metal must be strong to keep the wood in control. The wood controls the earth. So the earth needs to be held solid. The earth is the thing we stand on. It's our security in the world. And if you look outside in nature, what you see is that the ground is held together by the roots of the trees. So you see this very important relationship of how wood comes in and holds the earth in its proper place so that it can create the metal. The earth controls the water. So again, water needs to be contained in some way to have its power. For it to be able to contribute to the whole cycle, we already saw that the metal deep within the ground is the basin for the water. And now here we see the control cycle, the co-cycle, comes across, and this is just like the riverbanks. If the earth starts to crumble, the riverbanks crumble, and the water then just spreads out and evaporates. So what we see here is a very brilliant design of nature to ensure that the Sheng Cycle creates the elements, one creating the other, and the co-cycle holds everything in place. And this is just like the spokes of the wheel, and here is the wheel turning. And we know that the wheel turns because of the emergence of life that we saw when we talked about the basic concepts. And now we see how it manifests in this cycle that we live in, the cycle of our lives and the cycles in nature. An important point, the Sheng Cycle is a moving cycle. It turns the wheel. However, the co-cycle is a static cycle. It's holding things in place. So even though, if we take the analogy of a wheel turning, of course the spokes are going with the wheel, but they're really there to assist in the creation and the turning. So most of the time, the co-cycle, control cycle, is holding everything in place. And we'll come to this in more detail later, but what can happen when there are problems, if one of the elements becomes disturbed and it wants to offload disturbance, it wants to offload toxicity, it will activate the co-cycle and send what it doesn't want across to purify itself. And that's a very serious condition, which is something we'll talk about. But it's just worth noting at this phase that although it's a static cycle, it does become activated sometimes. And there's another situation that is a positive one, is that when we as acupuncturists are starting to help balance the elements within someone, we can use the control cycle to transfer energy across from one element to the next. Our job as a 5-element practitioner is to make sure that the 5 elements are creating each other as nature ordained, and that the co-cycle is holding everything in place and managing these relationships. And we'll come to the relationships in particular in the next talk, where we'll get a deeper understanding of who these guys are and what they really do.